business news, and it's a tale of two economies over the third quarter of the year. US output surged by 3.2% between July and September, a sizable upward revision from data published this time last month, courtesy of unfailing strong consumer spending. Meanwhile, the UK economy contracted over the same period, with output falling by more than initially reported. So what explains the divergence, and how do other big countries compare? Well, to consider those questions and the rest of the day's business news, let's cross over to London, where Arise correspondent Laurie Laird has the latest. Great to see you, Laurie. You are, of course, from America, so charity begins at home. Let's go to the US first. What's behind the big boost in output?
Well, I'm fortunate enough to be from both the UK and America, but you're right. I was born in the US. Let's start there. These were astounding GDP data from the US. 2.9% growth in the third quarter was the initial estimate. That was rounded up or upgraded to 3.2%. Nobody saw this coming, Charles. And the real big thing here was a big increase in consumer spending. In the first iteration of GDP, which came out about a month ago, consumer spending up 1.7%. That's a good number, a little bit disappointing, but that was revised up to 2.7%. So it shows us that despite this talk of recession, despite rising interest rates in the US now between 4.25 and 4.5%, mortgage rates much higher than that. Despite all that, US consumers are still spending, and that has much to do with that upward revision. A caveat here, though, Charles, when I say the US economy rose by 3.2% in the third quarter, that is at a compound annual rate. So it looks at the growth between the second quarter and the third quarter, and then extrapolates as if that growth rate extended throughout a 12-month period. If we break it down to simple terms, quarter-on-quarter growth was 0.8%, which is still higher than anywhere else in the G7, but it just looks a little bit less dramatic than that 3.2%.
And of course, Laurie, you are in the UK. As you said, you straddle the two societies. You're in Britain, a very different story there.
A very, very different story. We knew initially that the UK economy contracted in the third quarter by 0.2%. We had some updated information this morning. The economy actually contracted by 0.3%. Doesn't sound like a very big difference, but still disappointing data. And here the problem was a weaker than originally measured manufacturing. Now, manufacturing is only 10% of the UK economy, but a lot of that manufacturing in the UK does go to the export market. And because of some of the problems that the UK has had now trading with the European Union, particularly on the basis of small businesses, that really has got in the way to a certain extent of UK growth. And some interesting data out from the British Chambers of Commerce earlier this morning. They did a survey of their members, or at least their members that export to the EU. 77% of those members who do export said that the current trade agreement, it's called the TCA, Trade and Cooperation Agreement, that was signed 2 years ago by Boris Johnson. 77% have said that that has not made their job easier. The implication being that under this TCA, exporters are finding it a great deal more difficult to do business. And when you look at exports in the UK, it's such an important part of the economy. About a third of GDP in the UK is made up of exports. That's only 13% in the US. The US is actually a relatively closed economy, relies a lot less on trade for growth than a small open or formerly open economy like the UK.
So, I mean, Laurie, how do the US and the UK compare to other big economies, for instance, G7, G20, etc.?
And it's worth asking that question because we are talking about a worldwide recession, aren't we? We have been talking so much, particularly in Europe, about how these high gas prices may be affecting growth. The UK is far worse than any other economy in the G7. The only economy that contracted in the G7 in the third quarter, save Japan, which contracted by 0.2%. But Japan is, to a certain extent, a special case because of its declining population. But some of those European economies that we were expecting to do so poorly once the weather turned cold because of their reliance on Russian gas have done reasonably well. Germany up 0.4% in the third quarter, France up 0.3%, Italy up 0.5%, although Italy, a bit of a special case as well because it had such a great summer with tourism revenues. I don't think many people think that Italy will continue to grow at that pace. But the biggest surprise was Germany, which out of all of the countries in the EU was thought to be the one that was going to suffer the most because of the withdrawal of cheap Russian gas. So it really does give you perspective at how poorly the UK is doing at this moment.
And what about the world's second biggest economy, China? Where does it fit in?
A very good question, because China isn't part of the G7, despite the fact, as you say, it is the world's second biggest economy. China had a very good third quarter, up 3.9% on that quarter-on-quarter basis that I defined earlier, also up 3.9% on a year-on-year basis. That's a bit of a rebound from a very weak second quarter in China. So we did expect a bit of a rebound in Q3 in China. The big question in China is this sustainable with the government's handling of COVID? And we're looking at, again, a tale of two policies. So much economic growth in China was curtailed at the beginning of the fourth quarter because people were in lockdown. Now we're seeing the opposite of that. China, to a certain extent, is letting COVID go through its population, but the feeling is that perhaps the population isn't quite ready for that in terms of vaccination. So what we don't know is how China's looser COVID policy will reverberate in the fourth quarter. A lot of economists looking for a contraction in Chinese GDP in the fourth quarter, but of course, you always have to take Chinese data with a bit of a grain of salt.
Well, absolutely, and we've got less than a minute left, Laurie. It's the time of the year, isn't it, where bankers' thoughts start to turn to bonuses. But I understand some of them may be disappointed.
Some of them will be seeing the equivalent of coal in their stocking this year. Lots of talk that bonuses will be down between 30 and 50% this year, simply because a lot of the high volume or high margin business in the financial world, mergers and acquisitions, initial public offerings, a lot of that has completely fallen apart, particularly in the second half of the year. Bonuses last year were the highest they had been since 2006, so before the financial crisis. Again, as I'm saying, in some areas, bonuses may be down as much as 50%. So a lot of bankers will be a little bit unhappy this Christmas.
Laurie, thanks very much indeed. Laurie Laird is a Rise business correspondent, and she was talking to me there from London.